Welcome to today's story, which is also the last one for the year. And we've had some great speakers this year, and to have Dr. Donald Pulford with us is a very, very fitting conclusion. I'm Jill McPherson, and on behalf of the Friends Committee, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet here and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now to the business of the day. Our speaker is Dr. Donald Pulford, and I am looking forward to this talk very much. I first knew Donald as a young student at Launceston College, Launceston Matriculation College it was in those days. I didn't teach him, but did share a house with him for a while, and it was never dull. Now, firstly, to the education of young Donald. He was born in Ross on, Mrs. Pulford's here, on Mother's Day 1955. He went on to Ross Primary School, Queechee High School, Launceston Matric and the TCAE. From this period, I recall a trip to Lake Pedder, the Easter before it was flooded. 4 of us walked in, all non-bushwalkers, and camped overnight. Some funny stories there, but anyway. Apart from the stunning sight, I remember that Donald carried an extra burden. He actually walked in with a school bag full of heavy poetry books because the exam was coming up after Easter. Now, needless to say, he didn't open one book. But he's an optimist. Another memory is of Donald fashioning a caftan from a great bolt of cheesecloth and being saved from disaster by my mother, who couldn't sit idly by and watch the destruction. Her dressmaking skills ensured that Donald was able to channel Dennis Roussos, and he floated around the house for, I think, the rest of his tenancy. Finally, I recall how Donald, in the days before word processors, left the only copy of his thesis from the TCAE in a public phone box in Margaret Street. He still has tremors when he goes past that phone box. Now, in subsequent years, Donald's education stepped up a notch. He completed a Master of Letters at the University of New England and a PhD from Monash Uni on the political efficacy of theatre. He was awarded a Churchill Fellowship that took him to the UK and the US, and other awards followed. And a whole lot of things that I don't know about, and that's why I'm really looking forward to this talk. Donald's he's been back in Tasmania for a year, I should say, almost to the day, and in the thick of COVID, and he had to spend 2 weeks in quarantine in Sydney, which he survived. And in that time, we've reconnected, which is great. Now, he's currently editing a book on migration and Australian theatre and working on a promising theatrical experience that I hope he'll talk about, and everyone come and attend. So with a great deal of anticipation, I welcome Donald to talk about his life in, around and beside the theatre. Thank you.
Hello, thanks for coming everyone. I want to especially acknowledge my parents, Bill and Pauline Pulford, my sister Catherine and husband Norm Collings, my cousin Leanne and a range of friends, and to avoid trouble in that area, I'm listing them in the order and the length in which I've known them. There's bound to be people I've missed out. Anyway, let's see how we go. Vicky Croswell, Jude Ranson, Elizabeth Stackhouse, Meredith Clark, Margie and Pete Stackhouse. There's bound to be someone else, but I'll apologise later. Anyway, it begins soon. Does it begin? Here's my introduction to theatrical performance. We're at Ross Primary School. It's towards the end of 1961 and 62, and we're getting ready for speech night. I'm to be Old King Cole, and my grandmother has made me a regal scarlet cloak. I'm sitting obediently between two mothers who are standing to measure my head for the crown. I feel the measuring tape go around my head. Says one mother to another. That can't be right. I'll do it again. I'm all attention. It was right. My head, as a 6 or 7-year-old, was 2 feet round. In that moment was established in my infant brain an enduring association between performance and freakishness. And I think that most of us consider that there is something odd in people who choose to perform or set up performances for other people. But is theatrical performance as freakish as it might seem? Certainly it's odd. Seemingly far from normal to invite people to come to a space and sit in the dark while others, in the light, attempt to convince the audience that they, the performers, are someone they're not. Somewhere that they're not, feeling things that they've merely constructed, and in telling this lie, risking public humiliation as they get it wrong, risking public humiliation if they get it wrong or not right enough. Though it may seem freakish, something very normal, even essentially human, happens in the theatre. We are born effectively a blank screen onto which people around us project a range of scripts for our performance. The scripts with which they present us are determined by their assumptions about behaviour, emotions and beliefs attached to our sex, class, location, surrounding culture and so on. We unthinkingly adopt some scripts and try out others, shaping ourselves in response to feedback from people around us, our audience. In imagining ourselves, we also learn to imagine what it might be like to be someone else, to put ourselves into someone else's shoes. This imagination is the foundation of our moral sense and is central to our humanity. Without this imagination, our humanity is dangerously limited. It's distressing, therefore, that fostering and strengthening the imagination through education is not currently much in favour in Australia, the UK and elsewhere. I don't think it's an overestimation to say that the theatre picks up some of that slack and that in making theatre and going to it, we are helping to preserve an essential human activity and skill, imagining our way into other people's lives. After all, we are primarily and overwhelmingly created by culture, not genetics. Something else foundational was happening as we prepared for speech night at Ross Primary in the early 60s. We were all working together. Speech night was just one of a series of events that united the Ross community and marked the passage of each year. The church fairs, Anzac Day, the school ball, the fisheries picnic, the football club barbecue, Santa Claus coming to the town hall with gifts for every child on Ross. As I grew older, in Ross and beyond it, it struck me that we were most productive when we came together to create something for the benefit of ourselves and for others, those around us. That we were able to do more when working with others than we were when working by ourselves. The realisation is another factor that fired my love of theatre. It also shaped my politics. That first experience of performance at Ross Primary was repeated at various times through primary school, secondary school at Queechee and Launceston Matric. And at Matric, I was in a play that went to the then Little Theatre, now the Design Centre, maybe as part of the Launceston competition. It was a forgettable, drab little play, but I remember it because an exotic creature met us after it. It was Max Oldacre. Does anyone remember Max Oldacre? Well, here's the cover of a book on him. The Last of the Matinee Idols, with the booming voice and the bone structure and everything. This is about 1972. He's a Launceston native who went eventually to the West End in London and back again. In these theatrical episodes in school, I eventually noticed another thing about performance, that the tension of having to get it right heightened the senses, that around or in the theatre, life became more vivid, intense, clear, vigorous, and intoxication that I put to the side because I could not imagine how a life could be shaped in it. You know, we tend to see actors and imagine that's the only thing you can do in the theatre, and if you don't want to act, there's no room for you. Nevertheless, at 17, in my second year of matric, I applied to NIDA. Of course, I didn't get in. Instead, I trained as a specialist teacher of English speech and drama at the then Tasmanian College of Advanced Education. I'm grateful for that background that course gave me. I was trained and educated in a context that took education in the arts very seriously. In the 4 years of the course, we covered the Western canon in theatre and literature in English. There were minor subjects in theatrecraft and biannual productions. All of this provided a very useful background for my later experience in theatre. We were being trained to fit a very enlightened system of drama education in the Tasmanian Education Department. There was no pointless pretension about fitting people for a career in theatre. Rather, we were trained to foster students' language and communication skills, their capacity to take responsibility, to contribute effectively to a group project, to develop a fertile and flexible imagination. On graduating, I taught in Huonville and at Rees High School in Devonport. While teaching, I started to develop work as a director with amateur companies and ensembles that I've formed. After 6 years of teaching, I left for Sydney. It was a bit like running away to the theatre. Soon after arriving, I went to see the people at NIDA. 2 years previously, I'd applied for and been accepted into the director's course. It was immensely exciting because NIDA accepted about 6 people from, at that stage, about 150 applicants. I knocked back NIDA's offer because I really didn't, I'd rather go the following year, but my theory was that if I applied once, got knocked back, I'd apply the second time and they'd obviously let me in because I'd had the experience the year before. They didn't see it that way. The committee felt that I didn't have a sufficient commitment to theatre. In other words, if you knock back NIDA, there's got to be something wrong with you. I think Judy Davis and I are the rare 2 or 3 people who've actually ever knocked it back. Anyway, I lobbed up and asked what had gone wrong, and John Clark, the founder and head of NIDA, rang around and got me my first professional job in theatre as a stage manager for Catholic schoolgirls in Sydney. I also started as a workshop leader and director at the Australian Theatre for Young People. One of the people I directed at that time was the 20 or so year old Nicole Kidman, but she wasn't my first choice as for the character. Another girl was better, but her agent was unavailable. Anyway, around this time, Helen Keller the musical came into my life. This is the Helen Keller the musical that predates the one that was on television in about 2020, whatever that scabrous American show is called. But this is the original Helen Keller the musical. It was a hilarious, scabrous treatment that twisted the story of the well-known heroine's achievements into a high-camp show business romp. The dream to dance becomes the nightmare of superstardom. Our first venue was the Cabaret Room at Kinsella's in Taylor Square, then very fashionable, not much fashionable now. After a while, we were thrown out because the management didn't like the crowd we were attracting. We thought that this might happen and had arranged a transfer to the Paddington Green Hotel, which is a little bit less snooty than Kinsella's. It was then part owned by a woman who had made quite a lot of money in the 60s in London as the world's first transsexual stripper. Her name was Candy. Our first problem was how to generate publicity on a very low budget. The English farceur Joe Orton had found a solution to the same problem, the need for publicity but no money to get it. He invented Mrs. Edna Wellthorpe, a self-righteous, middle-brow snob who sent indignant letters to the newspapers protesting at the obscenity of Joe Orton's plays. For instance, she complained in one letter describing the play as Mrs. Wellthorpe's indignation excited bemused interest and did a lot for cricket sales. Ticket sales, for Christ's sake. I'm transported to England suddenly. We sent pretty much a copy of that letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, complaining about Helen Keller the musical, along much the same lines as Edna's. The Herald published it, can you believe it, creating a surge at our box office and unleashing a flood of hoity correspondence from Sydney-siders appalled that the august Sydney Morning Herald had not picked our rerun of a famous theatrical hoax. Lots of these letters to the editor were very witty and, to the Herald's credit, it published 2/3 of a page of them. 2/3 of a page of advertising in the Sydney Morning Herald would have cost a fortune. We got it for one 28-cent stamp. It's the best publicity coup ever. We also staged a fake demonstration with blind people trying to bash their way into Kinsellas with white canes. It stopped lots of traffic, and we had lots of fun, but that's as far as it went. Further, an editor from the paper sent a blind journalist to interview our writer and published the extended interview. We ran for a further 3 months. It was fun. I returned to Tasmania because a company in Devonport had received a grant to employ a director. Then it was Hobart, where I directed several productions for Breadline Theatre, and to Launceston, where I directed 2 musicals for Launceston College and Allenvale. At various times in this period, I taught and waited on tables in restaurants, that favourite theatrical fallback. I also returned to study, completing an arts degree at the Northern Campus of the university and a Master of Letters externally through the University of New England. I was enjoying study at last and encouraged by a distinction for my MLet. I applied to undertake a PhD at Monash. I was admitted and I'm so glad that I went. I thank Monash for opening up the world to me. Doctoral students were expected to have presented a paper at least one international conference each year. Monash covered the expenses. By this means, we started to understand how international scholarship works and grew confident in pitching ideas, applying for funds and forming contacts. I won a Monash scholarship, which was later upgraded to an Australian Postgraduate Award. I taught at RMIT in Monash while studying. In my 3rd year at Monash, I won a Victorian Churchill Fellowship to investigate the conditions of theatrical innovation in the UK and the US. Theatrically, there wasn't much going on in this period except for seeing quite a bit of theatre and becoming involved with the theatre collective in Richmond called Wax Studios, for which I directed a couple of things, including 3,000 Red Ants. You can see the kind of show it was. Not much dignity, lots of imagination. The Nat plays by the American beat poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti. At the other end of the spectrum, I toured a treatment of the life of Vidal Sassoon, the World War I poet, and started touring that around Victoria. Siegfried. Do you know, did I say Vidal Sassoon? Underneath this kind of highbrow loot is the heart of someone who prefers sort of low culture. Which Sassoon is it, Dal? Siegfried, thanks, Jesus. He might have been out of his mind, but his hair was fabulous. My appointment to Curtin University marked a return to directing, both of student pieces and my own work outside the university. Curtin had an extremely active performance schedule. It also began my increasing interest in British theatre and the possibility of my playing a part in it. Each year of the 4 that I was in Perth, I was at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe as a spectator. The Fringe features hugely in this narrative for lots of, I hope, good reasons. The Edinburgh Fringe is a theatre lover's dream. Nothing can prepare anyone for the scale of it and the variety of it. Here's some stats from a fairly recent one. Look, 3 million tickets, unbelievable. 3,800 different shows. In any given day in Edinburgh, at any given theatre space, the theatre opens fairly early, about 9 or 10 in the morning, and it has a different show at roughly hourly intervals. You get a maximum of 20 minutes to get in and get out. The pace is frenetic. Before leaving for Edinburgh each year, I would read the entire theatre section of the program and booked 4 or 5 shows per day for the whole period I was there. I kept up the same rate when eventually I moved to Edinburgh to work at Queen Margaret University. I switched from spectator to participant at the Fringe when I went to work at the University of Lincoln, and I would take 4 or 5 shows up to Edinburgh each year, generally 2 of my own and then some student pieces. For professionals, the point of going to the Fringe is to sell your work to producers and venues so that it has a life after the Fringe. Good reviews are crucial in this regard. With huge competition at the Fringe, getting noticed is hard. At the last Fringe, there were 777 media-accredited reviewers from 21 countries. Now, that sounds as if there's a pretty high chance of getting a review. It doesn't mean that at all, because the competition for those 770 people from 5,000 different productions is astronomical. There are several ways to increase the likelihood of being noticed. Being programmed by a venue that matters is a good start. Of the hundreds of theatres on the Fringe, there are only 5 or 6 venue managements that are worth thinking about. These are the ones that are trusted by the punters and the reviewers because they're choosy about what they program. Everyone thinks the posters are a good idea. I'm about to show you how they're not. Look at that. Those things fill up each day and they're so bulging with posters and pasted over that during overnight they're stripped again and they end up in that condition halfway through the afternoon. It's only a matter of minutes before each poster is pasted over by another one. The way around this is to pay people to protect your posters. It's just a huge vacuum sucking up money in lots of ways, this festival. The poster protectors rent walls, fences, giant bollards and so on, and they will put up and protect your posters on their put up and protect your posters on their territories. The Edinburgh Fringe is a jungle, and you need allies. Artists are probably better off putting material on the internet than they are than dealing with posters. It's cheaper too. New material should be uploaded at least twice per day. Artists and their teams spend hours and hours each day handing out flyers to strangers and talking to them. This is especially effective if they find shows like theirs and flyer people coming out of the ones that are like theirs. It's gratifying to have an appreciative audience at the Fringe, but that's not really the point of being there for lots of us. The people that you want to contact are the serious theatre makers, managers, and people who program festivals. And there are a couple of ways to get to them, but the best is to find out where they are and what their movements are. That's tricky and can lead to slight moral turpitude, as it did on my part. One year, I had a friend in the Fringe office. You can't waste that relationship. And she was arranging the schedules of visiting programmers. I wanted to get to a particular owner-programmer from New York. Her name's Elizabeth Kleinhans. Pardon me. She has a good theatre in New York where she runs a festival of contemporary British theatre each year. I used my friend to get her movements throughout the Fringe, and I stalked her. It must have been uncanny to Elizabeth how often she'd run into me. Like she'd be out, and these people are really busy. They're bouncing from show to show to show. There I'd be smiling away in the foyer. I already had her email address, naturally, and every day at exactly the same time, she would receive an email or a call from me with updates on our reviews and our performance times, should she have a break in her schedule. You know where I'm leading with this one. Lo and behold, one day she was able to see our show, which was shadow boxing, and booked it for her festival of British theatre in New York. Brilliant. By the way, Elizabeth's festival is called Brits Off Broadway. Spot the problem. And not long before we left for it, an actor friend looked at me seriously and said, "It's quite important that you don't speak." He felt that my accent would too easily reveal to the Yanks that I wasn't a Brit. As it turned out, I mean, everyone knows about the alleged American cement here when it comes to accents. They never picked it, even though they had lots of opportunity, because I'd never stopped raving at them. The Edinburgh Fringe led to another international adventure too. It was the same show, Shadowboxing. It had attracted outstanding reviews and quite a lot of attention, and an Italian producer-director recognised our actor. It's a one-man piece. He'd cast him in an Italian production of Hamlet and came to see our show to see how he was going. I recognised the Italian's surname immediately, Borgia. The family famous for political intrigue, murder, treachery. It's like, well, they have made a soap of it. Here's Lucrezia, 3 views. Do you think any of those look sinister? She's the famous poisoner. And my favourite, Rodrigo, known as Pope Alexander VI, who managed to father a large family while a cardinal and a pope, amassed a giant fortune through the Catholic Church, not unknown, and whose corruption is said to have partially inspired the Protestant Reformation. Well done, Rodrigo. Anyway, we were being hired by their distant descendant, Gianpiero Borgia. Gianpiero booked us for the Festival of the Adriatic. Unlike his dodgy relatives, he's a nice bloke and, as far as I could tell, not at all corrupt. Mind you, there was one phone call. I was trying to make sure that Gianpiero had enough money in place for our Italian season. The regional authority was footing the bill and I wanted to know how sure he was of it. His response to my query suggested something of his powerful and corrupt ancestors. "Don't worry, Donald," he said. "Politics is the family business." I no longer worried. Here's where we performed. That's the most glamorous and oldest of the places we've done shows. There were 5 curtain calls after one performance. It was astounding. There were translations being at the top of the screen, surtitles. The Edinburgh Fringe also led to my doing what I consider my best work. Weepy. Again, it started with loose connections. One fringe I ran into someone I knew from Launceston, Francisco Asqui. He and his friend were on the way to see a play and I joined them. This coincidence began possibly my greatest theatre adventure. The play Weepy is wild, a compelling mixture of styles and genres. It's masterful, a tour de force. The play is based on the murder of Mohammed, the true one, of Mohammed El Sayed, who was attacked by 2 18-year-old boys as he waited in his car at a giveaway sign in London. Threatened with a knife, he was forced to drive around the corner where he was stabbed 16 times. There was no obvious reason for the murder. The victim was unknown to the perpetrators, and there was no racial motive. People were reminded of the Jamie Bulger murder some years earlier, in which a 2-year-old was abducted, tortured, and murdered by 2 10-year-olds. But unlike Bulger, the Bulger case, where poverty and violence were easily demonstrated in the perpetrators' young lives, these murderers had privileged backgrounds. Everyone knows that rich people don't murder like that. Certainly the British felt that it was unlikely. Anyway, one of them had been to the then Prince Charles's School, Gordonston. People were bewildered and that impeccably polite upper middle class boys could kill, and kill so grotesquely. The then Prime Minister, John Major, was one of those more in the mood to punish than to explain. According to Major, we should understand a little less and condemn a little more. Weepy says no to that. It picks up on the military fantasies that inspired the El Sayed murderers and argues that we should look to the ways that we socialise boys to find reasons for the violence that is too often and too easily dismissed as thrill kills. It also sees in the murder a quest for the sublime. While much of this sounds unbearably gloomy, the play is not. It's often hilarious. With impressive and startling originality, Weepy combines scenes of the young men training to kill with those of a medieval French female mystic being interviewed on a television chat show. She weeps when she has ecstatic visions of Jesus. The scenes are hilariously mad, but they draw attention to the idea that as human beings, we channel narratives presented to us. I spent months tracking down the author and eventually met him in London. He was wary but gave me the script and I started to work on it when I returned to Melbourne. I pitched the play to a theatre upstairs in a pub in Fitzroy. The play seemed well suited to this grungy venue. It was programmed to start in 4 or 5 months. I set about assembling cast and crew. While that was happening, I had another productive conversation with a visiting friend, this time Jude Ranson from Hobart. She told me about an impressive young actor in Hobart called Hamish Michael, and suggested that I produce Weepy in Hobart with Hamish and someone else before the Melbourne opening. I met Hamish and cast him, and later his friend Andrew Casey, also from Hobart. Jude arranged a rehearsal space in Hobart. We were programmed as part of a festival and opened at the Peacock Theatre in Salamanca Place, where years earlier I had directed Talking With, an American collection of monologues for women, and an Australian play about a family obsessed by Elvis Presley, Are You Lonesome Tonight? Both Hobart and Melbourne seasons went well. The Mercury called the production extraordinary, graphic, hilarious. Discussing the audience reaction, Tagata said, "We feel exhilaration and disgust all at once. Perfect." Of the Melbourne production, the Australian noted that the dialogue bristles with aggression and wit, calling the production courageous and brilliant. For the age, this production is bursting with ideas and the effect is hilarious and shocking. Look, I'm not sold on reviews, lots of ways to contradict myself, but they're all about publicity. Most of all, it's about having great publicity and helping establish your reputation. A while later, I moved to Perth to run performance studies for Curtin University. My pitch for Weepy to Perth's Blue Room was accepted, and the Melbourne cast came over to perform it. The Blue Room is Perth's home to alternative theatre. It's an artist-led space run by a large membership of theatre makers. They received our production of Weepy enthusiastically and awarded it the Members' Choice Award for Best Production. I revisited Weepy when I moved from Perth to the UK, first to Scotland, then to England. In ways I've already described, the Edinburgh Fringe became useful in generating reviews and contacts, for selling the show to venues and festivals. The Australian reviews were useful in attracting critics. The British trade paper for the theatre, The Stage, was especially enthusiastic, awarding us a must-see. Another influential paper, The List, noted that, eventually, again, and that's what we were aiming at. For a hard-hitting portrayal of emotional violence and its shocking physical manifestations, this play is awfully funny, calling the show Such reviews helped our pitch to festivals and led to an invitation to an international festival in Dublin. This felt a bit like hitting the big time. We landed from England early on a Sunday morning in Dublin, and as we drove from the airport, we noticed large posters for Weepy on hoardings and bus stops. The festival was sponsored by Absolute Vodka, apparently the top-selling premium vodka in the world, and its lead publicist was a bigwig in Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, probably the most valuable company in Europe at the time. We felt in safe hands. This was quite away from the hand-to-mouth existence, the crazed flyering and frantic marketing of the Edinburgh Fringe. Our contract provided travel, accommodation, venue, some publicity and a box office split, and while we were still competing for critics and audiences, we only had 20 competitors in this festival as opposed to thousands in Edinburgh. 2 Australian friends came to visit me towards the end of our Dublin run. Like so many other Australians, we all had ancestral connections to Ireland, and we decided that we'd spend a couple of days exploring some of them by going south to Cork and back to Dublin through the middle of Ireland. It was towards the end of the run and there was nothing much for me to do. On the second day I was due back in Dublin for the closing party and awards night. What could possibly go wrong? We underestimated the size of Ireland. And the afternoon of the second day found us going like maniacs through Ireland to try to get back to Dublin in time to, do the right thing. But it became clearer and clearer that we're not going to do it. There was just no way we were going to get to Dublin in time. So we decided that the only thing to do was to relax and go to the pub. Besides, the actors would be there, and we chose a pub in Dublin near the theatre. We were enjoying guilt-free beers when I had a call from an excited actor. We'd won Best Production of the 20 or so from Ireland, the UK, the US, South Africa, Australia and Canada. And the director was nowhere to be seen. The actors carried on. We hightailed it back to the festivities so it didn't look disrespectful. The day after the festival closed, someone arrived at our hotel with large brown paper envelopes. In it were euros in large denominations. It looked and felt really dodgy. But we managed to bury our scruples and we sorted the notes into neat piles, one for each of us. Happily cashed up, we climbed on the plane and went smilingly back to England. Job done. Weepy had built up some momentum and goodwill that could not be wasted. We formed a company, Crosscut, and I looked around for the next project. Years before in Melbourne, I'd seen a solo piece called Shallow Boxing, performed in a derelict shop front in Brunswick Street with only a punching bag for set. It required an actor, preferably with a fighting background, capable of fulfilling the very high physical and emotional demands of the role. Johnny Collis-Skirl, one of the Weepy actors, fitted the bill. He's an excellent actor, but he was also a mixed martial arts fighter. We started work. Here again, the Edinburgh Fringe proved useful. For some reason, in this year, there was a buzz around boxing. 3 or 4 very good shows focused on it. Ours was about a boxer whose brilliant fighting career was ruined when he was outed as gay. Critics climbed over each other to find superlatives for Johnny's brilliant performance. The Scotsman noted the incredible physical achievement, while Scotsgay focused on the emotional punch. They're all doing boxing metaphors all the way through too. Apparently, wrong one, that's Johnny. Yeah, whoever designed the lighting knew exactly what they were doing. That was me, thanks. Broadway Baby called Shadow Boxing one of the most intense and hypnotic solo performances of this year's Fringe. Radio Fresh Air assured its listeners that Collis-Skirl is certainly one of the best actors I have ever seen in live theatre. My direction was described as incisive and empathetic, my staging as engaging, artful and understated without losing a bit of power, and my lighting as magnificently subtle. I don't know how you can be magnificently subtle. Anyway, I was apparently. And pitch perfect. We were a hit. And the following year we had our first funding from Arts Council England, a place in Arts Council England's showcase of contemporary British theatre in Manchester, and we finished the year performing in New York at the New York Festival I mentioned earlier. We cracked the holy grail of reviews, the New York Times. The review was pretty good, not great, but it was good. It praised my lean direction and described my lighting as nifty and admired the sweaty, impassioned vigour of Johnny's performance. The major aspect of the review for theatre artists is that the New York Times considers your work worthy of notice. In other words, if you've cracked the New York Times, it means it's worth thinking about. A few months after that, there was a British tour. While we were setting up the shadow boxing tour, I received a script from a friend in Australia. Half a Person was the name of the script, and it was another solo piece, a coming-of-age story blending narration and songs from the Smiths, sung live. My friend felt that the script was promising, but that it needed work, and hoped that I'd do it. I knew the writer from years before in Sydney at the Australian Theatre for Young People. I emailed him and asked for the rights, which he gave me. Luckily, I didn't need to audition anyone, because I knew an actor with a knack for audience contact and a good singing voice, Joe Murray. The backing track was recorded in Melbourne and we started work. This musical piece was a new form for me, and one of the first things I noticed is that the songs slowed the storytelling, which is what always happens in bad musicals. You know, the action's going along quite well and someone starts singing, and they sing for too long because the person who writes the songs likes writing songs. My solution was not to cut some of the songs, but to shorten them. As soon as the song had established its point, I found a way of ending it and moving on. It's a real advantage to be thousands of miles from where the authors are, including the people who have the copyright, although we paid it. Yet again, we targeted festivals as a way of notching up positive audience responses and good reviews to be used for pitching the show to venues and for advertising. There was Edinburgh, of course, but Half a Person also went to the Brighton Festival. Brighton's much smaller than Edinburgh, so there's less chance of being swamped by the competition. Its higher standard and proximity to London mean that it's well attended by industry figures that we needed to impress. It all went pretty much as we'd hoped in both Edinburgh and Brighton. The Sunday Times, notice that the publications have notched up. New York Times, Sunday Times, was impressed by Joe's timing, while the stage admired his singing. I wonder what impeachable clarity is like. While the stage admired his singing, of the show overall, the quotidian Times found it Half a Person was fairly easy to pitch to venues and sell to audiences, not only because it was a good show and well performed, but because it contained songs from the Smiths, a much-loved cult band. There was always a solid proportion of ageing Smiths fans in any audience, and younger ones too. The Smiths were from Manchester, and we were keen to perform there. At one stage, we had both shadow boxing and Half a Person touring England at the same time, and in a beautiful mix of coincidence and good planning, both tours finished simultaneously in Manchester. The contrast between the venues suggests the range of our work and the places in which we've presented it. Here's the Lowry. It's fantastic. Slick, beautifully situated, very professionally managed. And here's the other one. We played simultaneously in Manchester. I mean, on the face of it, it just looks scummy, doesn't it? But it's a sensational venue. The King's Arms, very much down market from the Lowry, the coolest, most prestigious fringe venue in Manchester. Ramshackle, even a bit dodgy. I think that they overpaid us. We kept quiet about that. See how you kind of have to lower your standards a bit sometimes to make things go? And they didn't mind at all. I don't think they noticed. It was brilliant, and so was the Lowry. Here's we had the tech, actor, director floating around Manchester at the same time, and here we are all back at the Lowry because we were getting free drinks there. Not after that. I had a brush with the West End, though. The Ambassador Theatre Group, ATG for short, probably the biggest theatre management company in the world. I had pitched shadow boxing to the ATG. They were interested, asked for the script, and summoned us to their London office for a meeting. And so it was that Adam, my assistant director, and I were in a taxi heading to their offices somewhere between Trafalgar Square and Whitehall. We alight over the road from a discreet 3 or 4 storied building. This is where theatre history is made. This is the big time. ATG is one of the 4 big theatre owners in London, and it has substantial interests throughout the UK and on Broadway. We announced ourselves at the front door, and when we emerged from the lift, there was a smiling functionary who takes us to an office past a big glass enclosure full of smiling, excited people. The number and demeanour of the people behind the glass suggest a first meeting for a West End musical, and I think it was. Everyone is unnaturally pleased to see us. After all, they may not recognise it, but we're in the Ambassador Theatre Group office. We might be the next big thing. We decline the tea and coffee, and a little later a young woman enters. She's wearing a deep blue silk shift. There's some discreet gold and a couple of discreet pearls. She's young, and her disproportionate self-confidence is grotesque. She's part of a type shaped by expense, more style than talent, and not that much style. She's happy to meet us. She's read the script. She has some reservations about it, but thinks that it could be good at Trafalgar Studios, one of their West End properties. She says that I will need to recast it, of course. Apparently, it needs a star to make it viable. Someone from Downton Abbey would be good. Or Game of Thrones. Or something like that. I resist saying all the things I want to say to her. I express thanks for her sterling insights. I ask her businessy things like timelines, deposits, stepped contracts, and so on. Charlie gives me her card and hopes that I'll get back to her soon. Big smile. It's been good to meet me. We all smile, and it's over. Charlie takes us to the lift, and when we're back on the street, Adam and I get into a taxi and get it up to an old, slightly smelly pub in Soho. It feels good to be out of there. We compare our loathing. Nonetheless, I spend a couple of weeks going through a catalogue of actors, contacting agents and sending out the scripts. I get a few bites and I narrow it down to 3 possible actors. one of whom was a featured butler with a central-ish role in a couple of episodes of, thank God, Downton Abbey. Next, I do the rounds of producers to see who will put some money into it and how much. Some of them are very receptive, but there's no money around at the end of the exercise, and I abandon the project. Bye-bye, West End. Things had flattened out for our company. There was a small tour of Harold Pinter's The Dumb Waiter, an excursion into theatre for young people, and workshops to foster new writing for theatre. But money and people were drying up. I had some ideas for work that I'd like to do, but they were large-scale projects that were rarely funded, and we hit a few brick walls. It seemed that our company had run its course. Then COVID hit and theatre stopped. I had always planned to return to Australia, and this seemed a good idea to do it. I had a call from an Australian telling me that unless I made a booking by the following Sunday night, I'd have to pay for my own, whatever it's called, where they lock you away. Quarantine. I made the booking and returned just over 2 years ago. I want to say before closing that I've had a lot of things on my side in this part of my work history. Parents that took education seriously, a high-quality state education system, the studentship system that attracted able students to teach and training, a Monash University Scholarship, a Commonwealth Postgraduate Award, a Churchill Fellowship, visiting fellowships at Harvard and the University of London, travelling fellowships from the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and grants from Arts Council England. It's impossible to consider the length and variety of my work in the theatre and outside it without them. At present, I'm tentatively involved in a couple of projects. There's a book on migration in the Australian theatre for a British publisher, and I'm planning a site-specific performance to be staged at a quarry on the outskirts of Ross. It will be another shift of form for me. I'll develop the piece incrementally, starting with poetry and adding layers of music, sound, voices, projections and images and movement. It'll take about 18 months to put together. An application for funding has gone to the Australia Council. I'm completely new to the Australia Council, so I've got no idea how it'll go. This is a delicate project that requires funding for each of its layers, one after the other, and it could fall over at any time, we'll see. And so this account finishes as it began, with me in Ross playing, and big-headed enough to think that other people might be interested. Thank you. What do you... Sorry? Oh.
Well, thank you, Donald. Now I know what you've been doing all those years. And I'm absolutely exhausted. It's fantastic. And a real insight into, aspects of theatre I've never really thought about, i.e. the business side and all of that. No, it's great. Does anyone have any questions for Donald? No, you've exhausted them too, Donald. And I hope it goes really well with the, what have you called the Ross Quarry?
Quarry project at the moment.
Quarry project.
Keep it simple.
What am I doing? Oh, no, I don't want to be on camera. I said it would be a fitting ending, and certainly has been. Those little anecdotes I told about Donald when he was about, 18, 19? 17? Yeah. Gosh, that young. Anyway, I forgot to say in my little introduction that right from a very early age, you could tell that this guy was going to be a bit special, and he's always enjoyed life, and the people around him really enjoy being in his company, and just great. So thanks a lot. And thank you, family, for turning up. That's terrific. I think we've probably got the biggest audience of the year, so that's terrific.